Well, the immigration problem is just the latest hit for President Biden. His approval rating also taking a hit, with just 50% saying that they approve of how he's doing the job. It's his worst polling to date. Washington Examiner chief political correspondent, Fox News contributor as well, Byron York, is here with us. Byron, good afternoon to you. Let's start where Aisha left off and talk about the challenges the administration is facing right now. It seemed like they were going to slip this through with reconciliation, and they're saying they still want to try to do it despite the fact that it's really not allowed.
Well, it was a really brazen move on the part of Democrats to basically create a big, comprehensive immigration reform bill and slip it through in a budget bill and not have it be subject to a filibuster. It was a real long shot for the part of Democrats. Question now is, as you just heard some of them say, maybe they can whittle it down a little bit and sneak it through. Not sure about that, but this was a really audacious attempt on the part of Democrats.
Yeah, and you're seeing those polling numbers are dropping. His numbers are even worse when it comes to the economy. People are suffering because they're dealing with high inflation pretty much across the board. The Fed, the White House, they keep saying this is transitory. But Byron, this is hurting people.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing, first of all, the president is now underwater by about 4 points in his approval rating in the Real Clear Politics average of all the polls we've been seeing recently. And I think there's several factors that are just coming together. One of the biggest is a decline in confidence in the president's ability to handle the COVID situation. That is one of the big reasons he got elected. He made a real mess of the whole booster shot situation. And you're seeing approval of his handling of COVID, which was his high mark early in his presidency. You're seeing that go down. On top of that, people are very worried about inflation. They are back to listing the economy as their top concern, and they're very worried about that. Then you have this terrible mess on the border. Then you have what he did in Afghanistan. So all of that is creating this idea that the president is either not up to it, or he's not doing a good job, or people disagree what he is doing. And it's a more negative feel than existed 6 months ago.
Yeah, what's striking me at the moment that's particularly interesting and also related to this inflationary problem that we have is how we're dealing with also the debt ceiling issue in Washington as well. We've got an October deadline. They need to come to some conclusion. And I always remind viewers, if we were to default, what that essentially means is that the U.S. Treasury can't pay its bills. And yet you've got all of these massive spending plans on the table. It doesn't make sense.
Well, traditionally, in debt ceiling standoffs in Washington, and we've had a whole bunch of them, both sides posture a lot. And in the end, it's up to the party in power to raise the debt ceiling. The minority party can, protest and say they won't agree unless the other side agrees to this or that reform. But it's up to the party in power to raise the debt ceiling. And I think that's what's going to end up happening here as well.
Yeah, and you look at this market, there's a lot of fear right now over what's happening in China. That's what sparked this sell-off at the moment. You had President Trump trying to put China in its place before things got out of control. Things are out of control, right? Our economies are intertwined. So you see this headline that essentially says a big property developer could default there and investors get spooked here. Do you think that there is more to this than just that one developer going down overseas, or do you think we've got a larger issue to think about?
Well, people do get scared about that because the reaction among most people who hear that news say, I didn't know this. How does that work? I had no idea. How does this company in China going under affect our economy here? So it's much more interconnected than most people would understand, and they're indeed worried about that. And the part about Trump versus Biden on China, Trump made standing up to China a real centerpiece of his foreign policy. And the Biden administration, again, has a much more muddled picture in it, and people aren't sure what the president is doing and why he is doing it. And I think that is another contributing factor to that decline in approval rating we're seeing.
And if I may here, just in the last minute that we have together, what the president is doing, what the rationale is, to go back to your point on COVID and booster shots, the White White House getting ahead of this, signing contracts for all these booster shots, and essentially saying you need to get them before the FDA got on board. Yeah, that's going to create a situation where people don't know what's going on. They're confused and they don't have confidence in him.
Absolutely. The president came out on August 18th at the White House and said everybody's going to get a booster shot starting the week of September 20th. That would be right now. I mean, he gave a specific date in the White House. This was news to the FDA. They were stunned by it, and they immediately began asking the president to dial back on this because they did not have the research, they didn't have the data, they hadn't gone through the decision-making process, and they were nowhere near ready to approve a booster shot for the general population. And the president sent mixed signals on that. You had a couple of top scientists at the FDA who left their job, who later contributed to a research project that disagreed with what the president had said. So you had Joe Biden, who, again, the major component of his approval rating early in his presidency was his handling of COVID. And then now you have this mess in recent weeks.
He was supposed to be the calm unifier, and we're getting a little bit mixed messaging here. It's hard to parse through it, but we appreciate you helping us, Byron. Great to see you.